Welcome to the Forging Honor podcast. I'm Jonathan George.
And I'm Benjamin Jones. Here at Forging Honor, we explore what it means to live as Christian men. Along the way, we'll be doing challenges, building habits and character through action.
On today's episode, Banjo and I interview Dave Raymond. We discuss passing on what we love through education, how education orders our loves in order that we may worship God better. We discuss the process of learning to teach, but also learning in that. We discuss some core habits and then give some practical advice for those seeking to expand their own education. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, it is challenge check-in time. As a reminder, challenges last for 6 weeks, that is 42 days. They are simple daily tasks to grow us as Christian men. The current challenge is to read or write something for at least 15 minutes every day. So Banjo, how are you doing?
This has not been my best week. I'll just level with that straight out. I have been, I'm in the first swing of teaching. We had our first full week last week. And doing education full time has meant that my own personal education, at least for this week, has taken a hit. After 8 hours of, filling young minds with I wouldn't say wisdom, but let's go with words. I have very little brain space left for words when I get home. And so I've been unplugging pretty hard. I will say this. I feel like I have been able to translate some things from I've been thinking about what does it take to learn a new skill. And I don't know if this is exactly in the spirit of the challenge, so I didn't count it. But I have been working on developing my math and research skills in my fantasy football league this year, and trying to improve my numbers there. So if anyone has some good advice and wants to mail in some tips for me, I will take it. But that's the most of my learning this week has been fantasy. How about you, JJ?
I think Banjo is just desperate not to come in last again.
Please, anything.
Anyway, so likewise, my reading has suffered this week. I will say, however, and again, this is a question of spirit of the challenge. So I only read 2 of the 7 days this week, but in the spirit of the challenge, I was learning nearly every day except Sunday. I've been studying hard for a certification at work. So I've been putting in long hours all week in preparation for that exam. So did I do to the letter of the challenge? No. Was I studying and learning? Yes. And it was good code. Good
that
code
feels
learning.
more legitimate than mine.
Yes, much more so, Banjo. At any rate, it's been good. I've managed to get a little more into that autobiography of Teddy Roosevelt that I mentioned last week. That's been fun. And then by pure happenstance, I started Dracula at the same time as my mother. So that's fun. We're kind of reading it together without realizing it. We just happened to pick up on that in a phone call last week. So anyway, looking forward to working through both of those now that my studies at work are over. But now we get to move on to our interview. Today we have on Dave Raymond. He has taught humanities in Middle Tennessee for more than 20 years. He owns and operates Quiller Tutorials. His history curriculum is available online at mycompassclassroom.com. He married his college sweetheart, and they've been together for 20 years and have 6 children together. Welcome to the show, Mr. Raymond, or Dave. It's kind of awkward for me.
No, you really should call me Dave. I mean, I think you've earned it. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are excited to have you on. As folks could probably tell, I'm used to calling him Mr. Raymond. Mr. Raymond he taught me humanities and I guess mostly literature and history. Thoroughly enjoyed those classes. So we get to have him on today to hear about education. So first, before we get into that, tell us a little bit about your background as an educator, why you got into it, and what you love about it.
Okay. Yeah, so I went to school at a small Christian liberal arts college called Bannockburn. Came before the current New College Franklin. And I primarily went there just because I wanted to read classics together. I wanted to continue classical education and so forth. I really had no intention of becoming an educator or a teacher. So at that point, I was toying with 2 ideas. One was photography. The other one was being some kind of chef, going to culinary school or something like that. And then, let me think about this. It was probably the impetus of wanting to get married early enough and needing a job like, well, I'll try teaching. So I volunteered at my old high school in St. Louis. It was a little Christian classical school. I was the first graduating class, actually. They put me in the trenches of working with seventh grade guys. It was my job to try to teach them how in the world to take notes in a rigorous history lecture and pass that exam, how to read a classic, how to journal, all of that. So we met in a classroom one day a week, and then the other day a week I got to meet with them individually and just check in with them and so forth. So I absolutely love that, and started remembering that I have all of these teachers in my family background on both sides of the family, going back generations. And it just kind of made sense. So I've been at it now for over 20 years, and hard to imagine doing anything different.
I love it. That's awesome. And your passion for it has really shown in my interactions with you. I know you have focused in on the humanities in much of what you do. What is your particular draw in that direction?
Okay, so it probably began with history. And I'll talk to my students about this at the start of the year. I'm doing that orientation lecture that I like to give them on why we're studying history, but also why we're studying anything at all and so forth. But that was history was sort of the foothold for me. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that growing up, I had a mom who every chance we got, we would go to a museum or go to a park of some kind or go to a historical site of some kind. And I was fascinated with the stories of what had occurred around us. So I still remember when my brother and I were exploring the golf course, maybe without permission, behind our house, and we went into the woods and discovered an old cemetery, and just realized there had been probably a house here, and there had been lives lived here and so forth in years past that were now apparently forgotten. And I think that reality, that sort of lived past lives and all of the richness of what's around us. And then, of course, when you actually start finding out these lives and you start reading into what people have done and you start seeing the heroes of the past and so forth, it can be quite encouraging. So I find that all fascinating. So that was kind of the early background. And then in high school, when I went to that little startup Christian classical school in St. Louis, I had a teacher who did a marvelous job connecting the history from the New Testament all the way to, well, Reformation and then present day. And that was just throughout the course of a couple years of history with him. And it showed me this sort of continual thread of God's providence from New Testament to present day. And for me, just in my church background, I had sort of been taught, hey, when you look at the past, when you look at the New Testament, you can see God at work. Same with the Old Testament, and he's at work today. And I believed that, but there was no connecting point between those two time periods, New Testament to modern day. And so realizing, oh, there's this continual thread here. There are a variety of believers who have poured in the lives of others who have come after them, and then you can trace that thread of the church and of faith being passed on generationally. That was kind of paradigm shifting for me. So that made history something very vibrant to me, and very much like a living thing. So that combined with reading the classics, and I mean, I tried to challenge myself in high school to read books that were harder. Like I tried Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton as a junior, didn't get very far. Finally read it in college, and now I have my high school students read it, who I have to say read it last week and did better than I did as a junior. But I mean, he talks about democracy of the dead, and he talks about the idea of listening to our ancestors and sort of giving them a vote, so to speak, in terms of what wisdom do they have to offer us now. And so, I mean, I get the privilege to teach that, and I've always gravitated towards history. Reading great books together is quite satisfying as well. And it kind of goes hand in hand with history, because you're looking at historical movements and so forth through literature. But to me, it's so much more than that. Like we're talking about Pride and Prejudice today in class, and with that book, I'm just asking questions and just trying to get discussion going and hearing what the students are observing. So I'm quite happy to do that. and to gain their perspective. But also, like, one of the things we did today was we just read the first 2 pages of Pride and Prejudice aloud. And I had a narrator and I had a speaker for every bit of dialogue, which is actually, at that point, it's just Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. But as they were reading, the entire class started laughing at key moments. Like whenever there's a real zinger there from Mr. Bennet, or some comment that Jane Austen makes that really encapsulates the situation in a humorous way, like, the kids got the humor. And that kind of liveliness where they understand here's what's actually happening, and they start to see, okay, these people are dealing with everyday human situations. Sure, it may be the early 19th century, and they may be taking turns about the room and not have day jobs, but that's not the point. Like, like that kind of reality, and then from there we can really talk about important things about character and so forth. Like, I love that. So I kind of came into the humanities really just from great teachers, from my experiences and so forth. And yeah, I've just kept there.
As a first year teacher, I have so many questions. Actually, second year teacher, I have so many questions about your 20 years, what you've learned, and tips and tricks and all that kind of stuff. I will try and stay away from too much inside baseball for the listeners' sake. But I do want to ask, as you're talking about, showing these kids Pride and Prejudice, and my gosh, those first 2 pages are as funny as they get in the classics. But I've had a real hard time as I'm trying to teach the kids. I've had a real difficult time trying to kind of put in front of them the value of something that is not 100% directly tied to a day job. Today I was asking a class, if you could learn to write anything right now, what would you like to learn how to write? And the very first response was how to fill out a tax form. And that's kind of where their mind goes. And there's not a sense of imagination. There's not a sense of curiosity. There's not a sense of, I want to pick up these books. And when they do, there's often a sense of judgment. These are old, dead writers. We don't want to read them. We want to read new ideas, all these kinds of things. And to be honest, as much as I love literature, those questions stacked on top of each other can become discouraging, especially towards February, as you know.
Yeah.
How have you learned? It seems like you have boundless curiosity and wonder and excitement. How do you translate that to kids and maybe even to parents who don't know what you're trying to teach?
Yes, that's a huge question, and that's like the ultimate goal of a teacher is how do you pass on what you love? Okay, so there's a lot to this one. I guess I'll start with I do begin with a pivotal orientation lecture for my students, and it is a question of why are we doing what we're doing? Like, why school? But then it always inevitably has to be a question of why life. And so I try to make that, I mean, it's part lecture, but it's also part dialogue. So trying to get them to answer the question, like, so why are we living this life? Ultimately, I want to take them to something like, say, the first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. It's a great answer to it. But I really want them to kind of immediately try to think through, if they're just there in a school situation, to basically tick the boxes to go to the next stage and then eventually get a job and then eventually earn income and then eventually retire and die, that kind of like vision or telos, if you will, just doesn't really feed the soul much. We talk a fair amount about contemplation, and actually one of the things I try to pull out from them, because James Shaw has an excellent essay. It's in The Unseriousness of Human Affairs, where he talks about, I think it might be the essay, wasting the best years of our lives. And so his whole point there is that we have this incredible time as students for leisure. And I try to unpack for them, okay, so the word skole or schola, based on the Greek or the Latin, essentially means both school, and it also means like leisure or play or game. Ludus basically means the same thing. And so you have this opportunity, I tell them, to learn things simply for the sake of learning them. So I try to demystify right away that we're not learning something for some kind of simple pragmatic reason. I'll tell them, like, half the things you're going to learn in this class, probably more than half the things that you're going to learn in this class, they're not going to come in handy in terms of, like, you're going to be asked in a job interview who won the 30 Years' War or something like that. That's obviously kind of pedantic, but what I'm trying to communicate to them is that learning things for the sake of learning things is actually a value in and of itself. So you have things like Socrates saying that the purpose of education is to teach us to love what is beautiful. You have Augustine not talking about education, but I think it works. He says that worship orders our disordered loves. I would say that education is a form of worship, and that would be based on that first catechism question for the Westminster Shorter. And so we're kind of training our hearts, which in turn are going to make us better people, which, yes, will have like pragmatic benefits in any kind of workplace, any kind of collegiate pursuit, etc., family pursuit, all of those things. But often in that case, what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring out wonder. So going back to James Shaw, when he talks about contemplation, he talks about contemplation as being a free activity, in that we essentially discover God in our freest activities. And so I usually talk with the students not about what are you excited about to learn this year, because that's never going to work. It's more, okay, what do you already like to learn about? So all of them have something that they have like obsessed over, perhaps, or something that they have read about. They've been online, they've checked out books, they have grabbed whatever they could about that topic. So whatever it is, I don't care how mundane it is. I don't care if it was like they were really into geology when they were 8, or if they are obsessed with fantasy football, or if they love, just to study like what's the perfect soccer cleat or whatever. I mean, the fact that they spend time doing something that gives them some kind of joy or pleasure, and they spend their leisure time doing that. I mean, it's especially good when they're like creating something. So like if they're artists, that's a great outlet, or if they're musicians composing things, or just even making up a song on their own. That's a great example too. But I try to point out that they all have things that they pursue, they naturally want to get better at, they naturally want to just know more about. And I'll try to say, okay, great. That is contemplation. Now we can talk then about like good things to contemplate versus lesser things to contemplate, but just the idea of contemplating something that you want to talk about, that you want to learn about and so forth, and then realizing that's a free activity, it's what you spend your free time on, and then telling them that's the goal of education. It's not a magic switch. It doesn't like suddenly make them into better people, but it starts to, I hope, get them to think differently about things. And then with the books, I mean, Experiment in Criticism by Lewis has been so helpful, because he's always very clear, like, it's not the book that's on trial when you're reading a classic, it's you that's on trial. And so I'll just tell them, like, hey, if you struggle with Pride and Prejudice, because I always have, it's like today was the easy one. I had 10th through 12th graders, little more, this group is mostly veterans, so I kind of figured Pride and Prejudice would be pretty smooth. They read Orthodoxy without much trouble. They wrote essays on it, and I'm like, guys, these were really good essays. I really didn't have to like knock anybody that much. So it's going to be probably a different story when I go on next Thursday and do Pride and Prejudice with 7th through 9th graders. That's going to be a different thing. So I'm going to have my work cut out for me there. I'm going to have to help them get over, somewhat ironically, their own prejudices about the book, and they're just getting them to try to see what's the value of these things. So it's such a big question, and this is kind of what I spend every day doing. I mean, some of it is having just like joy and energy myself, and praying through like, okay, this, for me, this is like a really good opportunity to be able to go and teach this. But I also have to be learning all the time. And I have to constantly be like digging more deeply, or reviewing something, or rethinking through something in order for me to have delight to pass on to them. Otherwise, it becomes too much drudgery. But part of that is me and my personality. I just kind of like feel like an engine sometime in the classroom, which I have to admit, it's a giving thing.
Yeah, I totally understand that feeling. I've had a couple. I just today, I was teaching a story that I love, and the kids were not. They weren't getting it, and part of that was the way that I was teaching it. But I did have this moment of feeling like, okay, wait, I have to slow this thing. I have to slow this train way down so that I'm learning this as I'm teaching it, and then kind of giving that back to them. I have kind of a tangential question to this, and I want to ask you this specifically because you're in the classroom right now. You're seeing these kids, and as a preliminary question, what sort of kids are you? This is a classical Christian school, or are folks largely? Is this a Reformed background, Christians and whatnot, or is this a wide swath of folks?
Yeah, great question. So these are homeschool students. So I see them once or twice a week. They, I'm teaching from Reformed Christian classical perspective, and in terms of my student body, they're, I'd have to think about this. Maybe anywhere from a third to half Reformed Christian, but then they span the gamut of evangelical Christianity in the Middle Tennessee area. Um, Thinking back to what you were talking about too, with like, today they just weren't getting it. That is something I see often. There are many times where something that I think is amazing falls flat or appears to fall flat. And there's a few things I've learned about it. So one thing that I've learned about it is, number one, it may not have actually fallen flat. There's often a student or a group of students who are really listening and you have no idea. And sometimes you find out about that years later. Sometimes it's more rewarding and sooner. Sometimes I think it's not immediate, but I've realized for a long time I'm playing a very long game with these guys. Now, one of the advantages I have working with homeschoolers is I see my kids year after year. So a lot of these families send their kids to me year after year, and that gives me a huge privilege because I'm able to invest in them and kind of realize, okay, you don't get it this year, that's fine. We've got most likely next year. Like for example, with my writers, especially like somebody would come as a freshman and could not write a cohesive sentence or make a simple argument. I usually found that sometimes in a year or two, like well, in a year or two, they would be better, but it usually took me 4 years to really get them where I needed them to be. And so that was kind of one of the first lessons of realizing, okay, I don't have to fix all this right now. And I think if you're in a situation where you get your students for 1 year, it's still a long game. And you're sort of watering or maybe planting the first seeds along the way to help them along in their journey. I also think we just can't underestimate how much the things that we say in offhand moments are actually used. And I get this because half the time students like will repeat something I said. And it's like, I don't even remember that. And it's like, I remember what I thought was the point. I remember what I thought was important. And then they point out something else. I'm like, oh, that's really, really helpful. I'm glad that meant something to you. I also think sometimes too, it's different. Sometimes, like, okay, when I did Dante's Divine Comedy 2 years ago with students, so we had a loud minority who didn't like it, who who quite frankly didn't get it, and we're really struggling. Like, I think we were like 5 weeks into Dante. Like, wait, is Dante a Christian? And I'm like, what? You're just out asking.
Oh no!
I'm like, how do we not know this? And of course, like, so, okay, sorry, I could go on about that for a while. But anyway, and then of course, they got really hung about purgatory. I thought I had spent a long time explaining it. Sayers, we were reading the Sayers translation. She does a great job explaining it. I'm like, okay, here's the point, guys. Let's not get hung up on this doctrine. Anyway, I had to realize there was a majority of the class who were loving it. And I got that from their journals. I got that from what they were writing about it. And then every now and then they would say something in class, but I had to wait for that. So sometimes it's really, I mean, again, the Lewis image this is actually from Abolition of Man, where he talks about he feels like the teachers of his time, which I think is true for us in a lot of ways, are basically irrigating deserts. So we're constantly just trying to feed into these kids. And I'll tell you, I actually see it more often when I teach Sunday school, and I get kids from all walks of life, and they're not my students, and they're not used to the classroom. Like the things I have to explain to them, sometimes I'm really surprised by, but I have to realize, okay, and I only have those guys for a year, and I have to realize, okay, this year I'm just going to get you a little bit further along in how to find your way around your Bible and how to understand how to read a Bible story. And we do the catechism too. So it's like, and understanding some basics of systematic theology. So it takes a remarkable optimism, which I would say is just faith that God is going to use that somehow. And it takes like a dogged determination to say, okay, I'm going to keep giving you these beautiful things, knowing that eventually it's going to click. That's partly why I have them memorize things. I also like the relation building is really important to me. So one of the things that we do that I think really pays off dividends in the classroom is we play lots of games, and we actually especially play games outside. So like getting them outside, doing something physical with them, builds an incredible rapport, but also like community and relationship. And you get to know them really, really fast when you figure out how they play a game. So, I mean, Jonathan and I have played Capture the Flag against each other before. He can attest to all of this, but like games like that, the way that they communicate kind of joy and concern for the student, and just the fact that like they're doing something physical and then we go back in the classroom, we have really great discussions. Like, I don't know, like all of those, well, I think it's just man being physical and spiritual, like those things do so much for the educational day. So there's probably like 100 other things to say about this, but those are some of the first things that come to mind, because that is such a huge question, and I so admire what you're doing, because it's not an easy task.
Well, I really appreciate those answers, and it's both very comforting and terrifying thinking about what they might pick up when I'm not thinking about it. But JJ, this is my last question here, but because I don't want to hog the mic with all of these teacher questions, but I do want to ask you, and especially because you're seeing a very different side of the academics than I'm seeing, teaching homeschoolers in the reform world and that sort of thing. One of the things I've noticed where I am is kind of just what seems to me bizarre levels of anxiety and fear in the kids, and just kind of strange obsessions and strange relationships and codependencies that sprout up between folks, and it's really bizarre to me. I'm curious if you've seen this sort of anxiety, even in the homeschool world. I'm a former homeschooler, so I've swum in those waters too. But I'm just curious, maybe enlighten folks that don't know.
Yes, yeah, no, we're seeing it. We're seeing it in various circles. It does tend to. These are just generalizations. It does tend to affect girls more. Especially kind of late elementary, middle school, that era, and so forth. It's been an issue for a while. There, of course, lots of people have talked about causation. We don't need to go down that pathway. I think everything COVID exacerbated it. Well, like one of the things I noticed after, it was something we never had before. So I take my elementary kids on field trips, and pre-COVID, going on a field trip would just be us, normal field trip. After COVID, or during the year where a lot of students were not in school regularly, we would be on a field trip and some random child would just join us and like just try to hang out with us and just be with us. And it would happen everywhere. And I found that, I mean, I'd never experienced it before. And the only thing I could figure was that these kids were desiring connection, some kind of like friendship and so forth. So I think those things were exacerbated following all of the responses to COVID and so forth, and lockdowns and whatnot, and school closures. But but that still doesn't explain the bigger problem. Um, Again, I don't want to talk about causation too much, but I do see a lot of anxiety, and I find that there's a lot of ways to address it and so forth. I mean, obviously, working with parents, and I don't know how well you're able to work with parents, but working with parents in that regard is enormous. I'm in a Christian environment, so being able to pray with my students or pray with a student in the hallway when they're really struggling is huge. Just finding ways to encourage them and meet them in their need at that moment of anxiety, and how to handle whatever they have to do. Like for some of the students, because I've had this before, just getting in the classroom is like the accomplishment of the day. And so then it's sort of like, okay.
Right. Yeah.
And so then it's like, all right, so we're just going to like let you be here, and we're just going to carry about our routine. And there is something comforting about that routine of knowing, okay, we're going to be doing the same things we always do because these are worth doing. And it's ultimately like a statement of like, and because God is on his throne. So we can still do these things confidently. We don't have to suddenly stop everything because there's a crisis. At the same time, I mean, because I'm acknowledging them, I'm trying to welcome them individually, I'm trying to meet them in the hallway and so forth. They're able to know like that I have a concern for them and I care about them and I'm aware of them. Sometimes it's developing a game plan with the parents, like what to do if X happens. Sometimes, I mean, I'm often recommending counseling. Just make sure they have someone that they can talk to. I mean, I remember I had a kid every class day. He needed me to pray with him before class, and I mean, he's doing much better now. But he just needed that kind of steady reminder. And it's both like the personal care from me as the teacher, but also like the reminder of like, yeah, and God is here with you. And of course, scriptures, giving them scriptures to know and to be able to recite, to deal with fear and things like that. I mean, especially in Philippians when it talks about like counting your blessings, and that's a way to actually combat anxiety and fear. But no, I'm definitely seeing it. It's definitely an issue. And I mean, you mentioned February earlier. February is when it kind of comes out. So being able even like to tell them, like to demystify it and say like, okay, you're gonna hit a wall here, and here's where you're gonna hit the wall. Like we know academically, it's gonna happen in February. It's just like a rule of thumb, and
it's a nightmare month.
It is. And I'm always like, guys, you have to recognize like this is going to happen in some form or another. But like, and I mean, I don't want to be too fatalistic here. So, but like when this happens, or when you realize like, hey, I'm really losing my motivation and so forth, like realize, okay, that's kind of normal at this time of year. Pace yourself, realize that this is not going to last. And the more experience they get at it, the more they're like, oh yeah, I've been through this before. I know it's not going to last. I still remember a couple of years ago just teaching them the basic idea that, a moment, and I can't remember where I got this definition, is essentially like 90 seconds of time. And supposedly like being able to process an emotion takes about 90 seconds on average. So it's like often you do have to give yourself a moment. Now, obviously that's kind of like really cheap pop psychology. So it doesn't answer everything. But my point is that sometimes they just need a moment to like stop and take a breath and realize it's going to be fine. And if, it's like, I just have to remind them, like, I'm here to help you. I mean, I always have the students who like, I know that they need help. And those are the guys who often don't ask you. So you have to go and pursue them. But yeah, this is the thick part of teaching and this is the real giving part of teaching, where you're not just like trying to pass on these amazing ideas. Of course you want to do that, but you're also in this role of caring for human souls. And it's both like a heavy thing, and also this really like just joyful thing to be able to walk with these kids, and realizing you can't replace their parents for them, and you cannot make them love the right things or do the right things, but you can point them out to them, and you can just be there for them in your role as an educator. And I think that speaks volumes.
I really love the passion that you show for your students, and having sat in your classroom, having experienced that and seen that grow. I mean, I still remember when you told our class, "Hey, February is coming up. It's going to be a tough time." And I mean, that helped me through college too, because none of my professors told me that in college. But I remember always thinking back, "Oh, Mr. Raymond always said this be a tough time of year." So plug on.
Yeah. Greg Wilbur always tells his students, don't make any major life decisions in February.
Yes, that is a very fair point. So looking at that and seeing the obvious love that you have for your classroom now and the students in it, thinking all the way back to early Dave Raymond, how did you foster that love in yourself at the beginning? You mentioned some classical education, some Christian education early on, but what for you personally did it?
Oh boy. Okay. So yeah, I guess confession. I think early on, the fear of running out of things to say in the classroom is what did it for me. So my first student teaching, I was supposed to go in and teach on the covenants of the Old Testament in a history class for an hour and 15 minutes, and I was done at 45. And then it was at my former high school, and my headmaster pulled me aside. He's like, "Here's how you can do this and extend it." And I'm like, "Okay, great, I've got it." And I went back for the second session with a different class, and it was 50 minutes. So, I like at first it was just like I worked my tail off, and I learned kind of discipline from that, and like, what do I have to have? And it was sort of like fear driving me, which is not a good motivator. I mean, it is a motivator, but it's not where you want to be. Um, so I think early on it was sort of like this better be good, and I better know my stuff and so forth. And then somewhere along the way, just realizing that so much of education, I mean, to paraphrase Tolkien, is repentance, and to realize that it's okay to acknowledge to your students, I don't have the answer. That's a great question. Let me see if I can get back to you and so forth. Those were some of my favorite moments, and being able to just like dive in and learn something because I wanted to know more, or I felt like I only had bits and pieces of something. This is especially true of history. Those were moments that gave me a lot of motivation to carry on. And sometimes it would be like I would find some interesting random fact, and it's like, guys, I can't wait to tell you this. And I mean, it's that. Sometimes it was a gift of a student. So I can tell you right now, I mean, I've been doing the elementary program for a long time, and I've had mostly the same kids there for a long time. And we do geography every class day. And I show them what, quite frankly, are amazing pictures and tell them amazing facts, but they're kind of used to it. It's commonplace. Well, I've got about half of the class this year is new. And every time I show them a picture, it's like oohs and ahs. And it's like, oh, right. Yeah, this is amazing. Okay, thank you guys. And so it's a reminder to me, it's a reminder to all of like the veteran students, like, yeah, we got to do this together. This is cool. So that's just a blessing. I mean, like I had no control over that. And I had a student for years who like she was like audible in the classroom when something was interesting. But that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes you really have to like look at body language. Sometimes you have to figure out what's the right question. Sometimes it comes out in writing. I have some students who are just not verbal in the classroom, but when they start writing with a pen, that's when that's when like you really hear their voice and you recognize, oh, they're actually into this. So I think those things really helped me. Just learning the discipline of it, and making sure like, okay, I want to read what my students are reading, and making myself do that. I mean, it wasn't always, it's not easy. I mean, I have 6 children. Finding the time to do these things has been challenging being able to have a proper work-life balance where I'm able to spend time with my family and not always be working, or if I am working at home to not be stressful around them like that. These are like personal things I've had to work on for the entirety of the 20 years. Um, and then for me, that also meant like being myself in the classroom and at home. Like I didn't want to be two different people. I wanted to be consistent in both places. So I think now I'm able, like some of these habits are just there. Like I get up early in the morning on school days for the most part, which this is like most teachers do this. Like we work long hours. And it's like if you want to be ready, it's kind of what you have to do. If you really want to like know your stuff and be ready for your students, it's just sort of a requirement. And now I'm at the point where I may not reread everything that my students are reading, but I'm digging deeply into my notes and I'm rereading passages and I'm trying to highlight what are the big ideas and so forth. And sometimes that is just as valuable prep for me as like, okay, I'm going to read every word and I'm going to write down every observation that I would do, say, in my 20s when I had more energy. But yeah, I'm those early days, yeah, was fear turned into discipline, turned into joy. So that's probably the summary of it all.
Fear, discipline, joy. There's a tagline for you right there for the episode. Fear, discipline, joy. One thing I always respected about you was the fact that I knew you were reading much of the material with us, and that's something I know a lot of my professors didn't. You know, they're just teaching the same thing every year. They're like, I've got it, and some of them legitimately did. But what always the question I always had was, did you do it because you felt the need for the content? Was it the fear driven side of it, or did you do it because you truly loved the process of it?
Yeah, so early on it was, well, sometimes it was fear, and then it was sort of, sometimes I would look at my notes and be like, I really don't have much here. Like I must have missed a lot. And so sometimes it was a legitimate exercise of like, I thought this was great, but I just went out there and just talked and didn't really actually dig in the text like I should have. Over time, it became more about, what, I really want to reread this with the students. And I really want to be able to experience what they're experiencing now. So when we read Orthodoxy by Chesterton, I reread it. And normally for years, my pattern was I would read and I would journal as I was reading. So write down all these observations, and then that would form the basis of discussion. This time I said, I'm not going to do that because I've read this book probably a dozen times now. And every time I notice new things, and for most of them, it's their first time through, and I don't need to just unleash all of these things on them. Instead, I'm just going to write down a 1 or 2 sentence summary of each chapter as we go along. And for me, it was like a personal exercise. Like, how can I do this? And maybe it'll be helpful for them. Maybe it'll come in discussion. It did a little bit, but not much. They had things to say, so it was great. But for me, that's like the best way to read. Like it was for the sheer joy of it. And I have to slow myself down, and I have to remind myself, like why I'm reading and the joy and the privilege that it is. Like we're reading Narnia right now in the elementary. The older class just finished Horse and His Boy, younger class is Magician's Nephew. And I've read those books. I don't even know how many times now. And I can kind of recite them. So when I'm reading them, the temptation is to speed read and to not really let the story work on me. And so I have to slow myself down and do that. So for me, part of that is saying, okay, I'm going to choose a time of day where I can kind of have quiet. So it might be at the very end of the day if I'm not too exhausted. Or for me, it's often first thing in the morning, real early, house is quiet, still dark outside. I've got coffee. And I can just kind of sit and enjoy. And I know, okay, I have this many minutes. I'm going to get as far as I can. Even if I don't finish what I assigned to them, there's going to be something here that I notice that can generate a discussion. So that's kind of where I'm at now. But I'm telling you, it took years to get there, and kind of just getting over my own fears and myself to be able to be of service to them.
I love hearing about that process and the discipline that it takes. Something, that Banjo and I have talked about previously is just teaching. In order to teach well, there's so much of that we have to have taught ourselves and have learned it ourselves so much. And then as you're teaching it, you're learning it again, and you're talking through that process. You've touched on several practical notes, things like you're getting up early, you're setting aside quiet times. Are there other core specific habits that you would say have really helped you to learn this material?
Okay. Besides the discipline and so forth, so reviewing the material I taught in years past, and I have things on cycles. So there's a 4-year history rotation, 4-year lit rotation, 4-year geography rotation, for example. And being able to revisit those each time, and I may not always have the time to do it, but I try to improve them each time. And on occasion, like for example, with history, on occasion I'm rereading like, oh, I've never read this historian's take on this person or this time period or whatever. So that's part of like that kind of learning thing anew process. I do think boundaries really help because, like, yes, you need discipline, but you also need boundaries so that, because this teaching is like an all-in activity, and it can very easily be consuming. And even with good boundaries, it's still going to be really long hours during the school year. So Sundays are really important. Being able to have those put aside for rest. I usually get my best ideas during the sermon. So, like I'm not actively working, and so like ideas just come to me. Breaks, whether it be like a Christmas break or something like that, are really important too. And I mean, granted, like school stuff does naturally take time away from these things at various stages in the year, but I find that rest moment is critical. For me, taking a break and going like for a run, for example, or like this morning, I have all of Tuesday morning to prep. But when you prep for like 4 hours straight or 6 hours straight, your mind starts getting a little bit addled. So for me, it's like, okay, I'm going to get up and I'm going to make myself a nice breakfast right now, like just the change of pace. So I'm going to take the dog out and play with her for a bit. Like those kinds of change of paces have been very life-giving and very helpful for me. I also, I mean, I didn't work by myself in a homeschool tutorial at first. I worked in a private school, and so I had peers. I had teachers who came alongside me and who gave me very practical advice. Like the lesson that you cannot replace the parent. you cannot like take that place or love these kids as fiercely as that. Like that's a huge lesson. Or even I remember a teacher counseling me because I think he saw me send an email at like 4 a.m. because I was up early and I was gonna get to work. And he's like, Dave, like it's fine if you write it, but maybe schedule it for later. It was sort of like just you don't want to give the impression that like you're always available, and that again is like the boundary thing. Yeah, there's a lot to it. Some of it is just sticking with it and so forth. Um, yeah, that's what comes to mind right now.
So when Dave Raymond goes on a break away from all the school, what does he read?
Oh boy, this summer I read James Blaylock for a while. Reread his Last Coin and Paper Grail, and then I got into Les Mis, which I'm still in Les Mis right now. And I tried Les Mis probably 15 years ago, and when I realized there's like 70 pages on the bishop, I'm like, I'm out. And now, now I'm like, I kind of enjoy this like really slow, deliberate buildup and the interconnectedness of everything.
So
So
you've never read it
that
before?
book. So good.
You'd never
So
read
good.
Les Mis?
No.
Or is
no.
Oh wow. Well, I got Dave Raymond beat on one book somewhere, and I read it
There you
faster too. So let's go. Add that to the list of accomplishments in my life. I interrupted you though.
Oh, I mean, there's that. For me, getting away from the house, doing some kind of travel really helps too, because it helps me disconnect somewhat from the life of school and so forth, which I think is needed. But yeah, for me, a big theme has been proper times of rest and just trying to be present when I'm home. And I mean, I think this is true of everyone who works outside the house. I mean, being able to come home and like prepare yourself, especially when the kids were little and like they are so excited to see you, and just being able to prepare yourself for that and like the joy and the privilege that is, what was huge to me. And again, that's like a prayer thing all the time. But yeah, those are some of the key lessons I can think of.
I have a question that I'm hoping can make us better podcasters here. One of the skills of a great teacher, and I think of a great student too, is learning how to ask great questions. And specifically when you're teaching and when you're podcasting, dare I say, you have to ask a question that is gonna bring out a good conversation, is gonna lead to good dialogue. How do we do that? How do we get better at asking good questions?
Yeah, I'll tell you when I figure that out.
It's a mystery.
So, okay.
I love the honesty.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm always working on this. Okay, so I I think a great question, especially when dealing with a book, you don't want to lead the witness too much. So I try. I may do that more with elementary kids, honestly, just where they're at. But with my older students, I'm trying to get them to critically think and think for themselves and so forth. So it may be a more general question. One of the masters I know of leading discussions, Brandon Spun at New College, and Brandon is very comfortable with silence. He's very comfortable asking a question and just waiting. And that is something that I have had to try to incorporate in my classroom more. And it's not easy, especially if you have high schoolers who are quick to say awkward silence. Like, well, it is now. So yeah, with good questions, I think for me, it is kind of thinking like, well, what did I notice about this? And sometimes it is starting with that question, like, what stood out to you? What did you notice? Or what do you think about this character? Or what do you think about this writing style? It was one of the ways that I do this in the classroom with my older students, so seventh on up. Actually, I do this with the elementary too, is I'll have them just do extemporaneous journaling. And I'll ask them a question. I'll tell them, I'm going to collect this, but like, I don't really care about your spelling, punctuation, any of that. I just want you to get your thoughts on paper. And your goal is to not stop writing. So I'll ask them a question about the text. Like, I think today it was something like, what does Jane Austen write well? I mean, it was that vague. And like, or how does she write well? And those, you can take those in so many directions. Well, they all wrote and they all had something to say and they largely agreed with each other. And just that process of putting it on paper suddenly gives them something to talk about. And you can even in the classroom, you can call upon somebody who maybe doesn't talk and say, what'd you write about? And whatever they wrote about, even if they give an answer that's obviously not that great, unless you're trying to be like belligerent or downright, like, I don't know, sarcastic or something like that, even if it's not a great answer, I'll try to pull something out of that and say, oh, well, that's actually a good point there, or you're right about this. But yeah, the art of a good question, I mean, it's an art, and it's a constantly developing thing. And there's so many times I think to myself, yeah, that wasn't a great question.
Yeah. Well, it was a good answer. I have one last serious question, and then I always like to end on a left field question. So I'll save my left field question for the end. But this is my last teaching question too. So sorry for folks who may not find this as interesting as I do, but this has been super helpful. I've been taking copious notes, and hopefully I teach my best class ever tomorrow with my new information. But sometimes as a teacher, I hope
for your sake, not ever. You're teaching.
Oh,
that's right. Yeah,
that was it.
Just the beginning.
I peaked in year 2. That's right. No, but sometimes I have this feeling as I'm reading through student responses that the only thing I'm getting out of my students is fear. That when I've asked a question or I've given a test or whatever it is, their response is not them thinking critically. It's not them giving their imagination. It's them trying to give me what they think I want to hear. And maybe that's a judgment thing. Maybe that's wrong. But I sometimes feel like I'm not really getting to see the student so much as I'm getting to see a front that they're putting up. Do you have any advice on helping kids to be unafraid in the classroom?
Yes. Okay. So part of that is, I mean, you guys had George Grant on here recently, right? So George is a master of, he'll ask a question, someone will answer it. They could be like categorically wrong. And he will be like, you have a good point there. And he'll draw something they said. And it's not like he's being dishonest. Like he'll take an honest thing that they said and he'll turn it into this marvelous thing. So sometimes, and again, that may be just a God-given ability he has. I'm not sure, but being able to encourage them consistently to just give their, you kind of have to lead them into giving their honest impressions of something. And again, you have to kind of be careful with it because you don't want them just complaining all the time. But I often have to cut through a lot of I just call it Christianese or evangelical language. I mean, I some of the essays I read recently on orthodoxy were, I could tell these students were trained in how to spew a bunch of Christian sounding rhetoric, but not really content. And so I'm not saying that to them because that would just be demoralizing. So what I'm doing instead is I'm asking them questions along the way, what did Chesterton say about progressivism here? Or what kind of paradoxes does he mention? Because you mentioned that. Or what did he say about utopias here? I mean, something like that, whatever it is. But I think a big part of it is you're always kind of trying to draw things out of them and just telling them, I really want your thoughts. I really want your opinions. I think really matters. So if it partly depends on what it is. I mean, if it's something objective, like you're asking, what are the elements of photosynthesis? I mean, that's not really your opinion. That's a settled thing. If it's more the humanities, and so it's more, what were your first impressions of Mr. Darcy, for example? Then you're looking for honest reasons. You don't just want fluff. You want to discourage them from just telling you what you think they want to hear. But that is the tendency of students, especially in certain environments. And so I think just trying to create an environment where you're encouraging, no, I actually want to know what you specifically think, I think is huge. And that's where too, we didn't even talk about this, but this is where the games come in, but also the in-between times, anytime you just talk to a student and you're asking them about what they like to do besides, when they're not doing school, and you're getting to know them and so forth. Anytime you're investing in that relationship, I think is key. I ask my elementary students every Monday, so what was one thing you did over the weekend? Or one interesting thing that's coming up in your life? And they love that, but it's also just sort of, it helps them realize that they and their own voice are valued, because that's what you want your students to have. You want them to have a voice in their writing, which is going to come from them being able to critically think. And of course, you're going to be, teaching them wonderful ways to think and teaching them a solid theology and all of that. But you have to create that environment where they're comfortable being themselves. And you really want them to be themselves at school, which in homeschooling sometimes means they take their shoes off. So there are some pitfalls here to be aware of.
Some problems. One thing that's interesting about the humanities is you're exactly right. It's easy to come to a text and come with a lot of different opinions about it. And yet at the same time, we know that there is one truth to the entirety of reality in a sense. So it sounds like there's this balance between, learning how to draw out those opinions and seeing, okay, where is the truth in that? It's like, you look at mathematics as opposed to the humanities, 1 + 1 is always 2. And that's just how it is. Now, what gets interesting is there's so many different ways of looking at that and looking at that equation. And it sounds like there's some of that going on a little bit with what you're doing, in terms of drawing out these opinions and helping people understand, oh, here's one way of looking at 2 and 2 equals 4, or different ways of putting that together. Of course, you're doing it with wonderful books of literature. So I don't really have much of a question out of that. Just, it was a thought I was having, thinking it's interesting, just the different ways that we can approach truth and realize it as Christians, realizing we're trying to teach the one truth through that process.
Yes. Yeah, I think we have, we have standards we can appeal to. I mean, anytime we're looking at a character, we're appealing to standards. If we're evaluating, we're always evaluating and we're always judging. And ideally, the student is considering their own life and their own actions and their own relationships. Or today I was teaching the Enlightenment period of history. So we're looking at major Enlightenment thinkers and we're talking about their worldview. And it's sort of like, well, okay, so this right here makes sense and this right here makes sense, but this right here is where they go off the rails. So there is definitely some kind of standard that we're constantly appealing to. With literature, I'm often asking them for symbolism, especially in poetry. Like, where do you see this in the scriptures? Let's use that to help us understand how this might be used here and so forth. But that's the bread and butter too of Christian education.
Wonderful stuff. Banjo, you have a left field question, and then I have my final question.
All right. Hopefully this is left field enough. So, I don't know about you when you're teaching, David, but for me, when I'm teaching, I'm a huge movie nerd. I love all kinds of movies. My problem is that my favorite genre of movies is, mafia gangster movies. Full of violence and all this sort of thing, and sometimes there's just the perfect image of what I want is in these movies, and sometimes I'll dance around the topic without ever actually naming the movie, or I'll often trip up and say, oh, there's this one movie, and they say, what is it? And I go, well, you can't watch it. So I'm curious. Maybe you're of purer heart than I. But is there any movie or book or TV show that you're constantly thinking, oh man, I wish I could reference this, but this is not the right setting for that?
Yes. I nothing specific is coming to mind right now. I do make a lot of Star Wars references in class, and that's thankfully universal. A lot of Harry Potter as well. But no, there are definitely sometimes shows or movies. Oh, I'm trying to remember. I actually did mention, I can't remember what it was now. I did mention a movie in class the other day, and I'm like, and by the way, you all are too young to watch this. So I'm always worried they're going to go home. Mr. Raymond said we should watch this.
It was great.
Yeah, but it does happen. But I get it. You're like, hey, there's this perfect scene in Apocalypse Now. Children, I'm going to tell you about this right now.
For me, it's The Godfather. Like once a week, I'm like, oh, The Godfather would be perfect for this. And then I go, no, wait, I can't explain. I can't explain that.
What you could do is you could just do Godfather references all year long. It'd be like Easter eggs. So then years from now, they're going to watch The Godfather and be like, oh, it was genius what he was doing the entire time.
That's right. I handed in their tests and I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. So, there we go.
Excellent. My final question is generally always the same, because this show is geared towards young men who most of us at this point will have graduated. I know there are several folks who have not that listen to the show, but they're listening to this and maybe they haven't had a wonderful teacher like you, a wonderful education, and they're thinking, oh man, I missed out. And I want to fix that. I want to go through and learn some of these things, talk about these things, explore these things. Where should they start tomorrow?
Where should they start tomorrow? Find someone to read with. Find someone else. I mean, if you can, or at least find someone to listen to. So that might be a good podcast out there, like this one, of course, or something that's specifically getting into the great books or the classics or something like that. That might be someone who posts often about things that are worth reading. But looking for someone who can mentor you, teach you, or even just read alongside you, I think is probably the biggest thing. And I lucked out. I mean, I had that in my high school and then in my college. And I picked a career that kind of forced me into it steadily. There's no way I'd be doing this otherwise, because I don't think I'd have the discipline on my own. But yeah, I mean, start pursuing these things. I think, find someone you can work, you can listen to, that can guide you and so forth, and just start reading.
Well, very good. Banjo, it sounds like we need to revive our regular daily text stream to remind ourselves to do these things. That's what I.
That's right. Yeah. Back to the accountability zone.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today, Mr. Raymond, or Dave Raymond. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I hope you have as well. And listeners,
yeah,
I hope
I
you
have.
Well.
Thanks for having me, guys.
This has been the Forging Honor podcast. Music and production is by Elliot George. For more information about what we do or to learn how to get involved, visit our website at forginghonor.com. There you'll find information about our community, the Forge, and how to join other young men seeking to glorify God in thought, word, and deed. You'll also find blog articles, book recommendations, and more ways to grow as a Christian man.
If you enjoyed the show, please tell a friend or family member about Forging Honor. We would also appreciate it if you would take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, a rating and review only takes a moment, and it goes a long way towards growing the Forging Honor community.
Thanks for taking the time with us today. We hope you'll take up the work alongside us and join us in the task of Forging Honor. We'll see you next time.